How many deaths does it take before someone listens to the truth? In 1822, as yellow fever swept through the port town of Natchez, Mississippi, with biblical fury, a man named Jonas Ryder, property of the Fairmont plantation, stood before the city's medical board with blood-stained hands and a remedy that had already prevented dozens of deaths among his fellow enslaved workers. The physicians, draped in their formal coats and armed with degrees from prestigious Eastern universities, looked down at this illiterate field hand as if he were offering them dirt and superstition. They dismissed him without a second thought, returning to their bloodletting bowls and mercury treatments. What those doctors didn't know, what they refused to acknowledge, was that Jonas had learned his cure from the dying whispers of a woman who'd survived 3 fever outbreaks in Saint-Domingue before being sold to Mississippi. And as the body count climbed past 100 in just 2 weeks, with entire families wiped out in the elegant homes along Silver Street, Jonas faced an impossible choice: watch hundreds more die while waiting for official permission, or act without it, knowing that the penalty for an enslaved person practicing medicine was death. This is the story of how knowledge became a crime, how pride became a plague, and how a man with everything to lose became the only thing standing between a city and annihilation. Natchez sat like a jewel on the Mississippi River, perched high on the bluffs, looking down at the muddy waters that carried cotton, commerce, and, in the summer of 1822, death itself. By that year, Natchez had grown into one of the wealthiest cities in the American South. Its prosperity built entirely on the backs of enslaved labor and the white gold of cotton flowing through its port. The city was divided as clearly as the line between the river and the sky. Natchez on the hill, where the plantation owners lived in columned mansions with French wallpaper and crystal chandeliers, and Natchez under the hill, the lawless waterfront district where riverboat workers, gamblers, and traders crowded into ramshackle taverns that never closed. Jonas Ryder had lived his entire 34 years in bondage, first in Louisiana, then at the Fairmont plantation 10 miles north of Natchez proper. He'd been purchased at age 8 alongside his mother, separated from his father in New Orleans, at an auction he could still see when he closed his eyes. The Fairmonts were considered, by the standards of the time and place, reasonable owners, which meant the whippings were infrequent, the rations barely adequate, and the work relentless, but not quite fatal. Jonas worked the cotton fields from can see to can't see, his hands permanently stained from the bowls, his back marked with scars that had faded to white lines against his dark skin. What set Jonas apart from the other 130 enslaved people at Fairmont wasn't physical strength or submission. It was his mind. He absorbed information like the earth absorbed rain, remembering every conversation he overheard, every treatment he witnessed, every plant and root the older enslaved people used for remedies. He couldn't read or write. Teaching the enslaved to read was illegal in Mississippi, punishable by 39 lashes. But his memory was flawless. He could recall the exact mixture of herbs an elderly woman named Lucinda had used to stop infection in a child's wound 3 years prior. He remembered how Thomas, a man who'd been brought from Jamaica, described which leaves to chew for stomach pain. Jonas collected this knowledge the way some men collected coins, storing it away for when it might mean the difference between life and death. In March of 1821, the Fairmonts acquired a new enslaved woman from the estate sale in Louisiana. Her name was Margot, though she'd been called many names before that in a life that had carried her from West Africa to Saint-Domingue, from the chaos of the Haitian Revolution to Louisiana, and finally to Mississippi. She was probably 50 years old, maybe older. With silver hair she kept wrapped in an indigo cloth and eyes that had witnessed empires fall. Margot barely spoke English, and when she did, her words carried the musical lilt of French Creole. The other enslaved people at Fairmont gave her a wide berth at first. She was strange, foreign, moved differently, spoke differently, looked at you like she could see things you'd rather keep hidden. But Jonas saw something else in Margot: knowledge. She knew plants in a way that went beyond simple remedies. She could look at a person and know what was wrong inside them before they spoke a word. She kept a small leather pouch under her clothing that contained dried leaves, seeds, bark fragments, materials Jonas didn't recognize. He began to seek her out in the evenings, after the work was done, sitting near her cabin and asking careful questions. At first, she ignored him. Then, slowly, she began to answer. Margot told him about Saint-Domingue, about the yellow fever that came in waves during the wet season, turning whole plantations into graveyards. She described how the fever started. The sudden chills, the back pain, the eyes turning the color of old ivory, then the terrible black vomit that meant death was coming. The doctors, she said in her broken English, mixing French words with the explanation, they bleed people. They give mercury. They kill more than the fever kill. She spat after saying this, a gesture of disgust that needed no translation. She taught Jonas about cinchona bark, though she called it by a different name, quinquina, and how it had to be prepared in a specific way, boiled at a specific temperature, given in specific doses. She showed him a bitter root that reduced fever, leaves that settled the vomiting, preparations that kept the blood from becoming too thin. Most importantly, she taught him about mosquito control, though she didn't use those words, didn't know the science behind it. She simply said, "The sickness come from bad air near water, when it's hot. Where mosquitoes thick, sickness thick. You keep mosquitoes away, you keep some sickness away." Jonas listened to everything, remembered everything, understood that he was being given something precious, the power to save lives. But he also understood the danger. Enslaved people who practiced medicine without approval, who were seen as possessing power or knowledge that threatened the established order, often disappeared. They were sold south, to the brutal sugar plantations where survival was measured in months, not years, or they simply vanished one night, a lesson to others who might think they were more than property. Margot survived only 7 months after arriving at Fairmont. In October 1821, she collapsed in the fields, and within 2 days, she was dead. The plantation doctor said it was exhaustion and age. Jonas, washing her body for burial as was the custom, saw the yellowing of her eyes, the fever-wasted frame, and suspected she'd fought yellow fever before and finally lost. But before she died, Margot had pressed her leather pouch into Jonas's hands and whispered something in French he didn't fully understand, but felt in his bones. "Sauvio. Save them." The fever arrived in Natchez on June 14, 1822. It came up the river on a steamboat called the Providence, which docked at Natchez under the hill after a slow journey from New Orleans. The boat's manifest listed cotton, barrels of whiskey, farm equipment, and 23 passengers. What it didn't list was the cargo of death breeding in the water barrels and the shadows of the hold, Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, carriers of yellow fever, waiting for warm blood and new territory. The first victim was an Irish dock worker named Patrick Hannigan, who unloaded the Providence's cargo in the brutal midday heat. He felt fine that afternoon, stopped at a tavern under the hill that evening, drank whiskey and played cards. By the next morning, he was shivering so violently his bunkmates could hear his teeth chattering through the thin walls. The fever climbed to heights that made him delirious. He vomited, complained of back pain so severe he couldn't stand, and within 72 hours of the first symptom, Patrick Hannigan was dead. The doctor who examined the body, a young physician named Dr. Raymond Fletcher, noted the symptoms, high fever, back pain, jaundice, and knew immediately what he was looking at. Yellow fever, the terror of every southern port city, the scourge that could wipe out a quarter of a population in a single summer. He reported his findings to the mayor and the medical board, a group of 6 physicians who oversaw public health in Natchez and the surrounding county. The medical board, led by Dr. Cornelius Howell, a 60-year-old graduate of the University of Pennsylvania who'd practiced in Natchez for 30 years, convened an emergency meeting on June 17th. Their approach to yellow fever was based on what they'd learned in medical school, on the established wisdom of the day. The fever was caused by miasma, Bad air, rising from rotting organic matter, from the filth of the river district, from the moral decay of places like Natchez under the hill. The treatment was aggressive, bloodletting to remove poisoned blood, mercury compounds to purge the system, cold baths to bring down fever, isolation of the sick to prevent the spread of corrupted air. Notices were posted throughout Natchez. Citizens were advised to avoid the waterfront, to burn tar and sulfur to purify the air, to seek immediate medical attention if fever developed. The city's physicians prepared their instruments, lancets for bloodletting, porcelain bowls to catch the blood, bottles of calomel, mercurous chloride, for purging, laudanum for pain. They were trained, educated, confident. They were also, though they didn't know it, about to make everything worse. By June 20th, there were 14 confirmed cases in Natchez under the hill. By June 23rd, 37 cases, with 9 dead. The fever wasn't respecting the invisible line between the riverfront and the bluffs. It climbed the hills into the wealthy district, appearing first in the home of Judge Samuel Fairfax, whose daughter Eleanor came down with the characteristic symptoms after visiting a dressmaker under the hill. Eleanor Fairfax was 19 years old, engaged to be married, planning a wedding for September. She died on June 25th, and her death sent shockwaves through Natchez on the hill. If the fever could kill a judge's daughter, it could kill anyone. The body count accelerated with horrifying speed. The cemetery couldn't keep pace with the burials. Coffin makers worked around the clock. The churches held constant funeral services until the priests themselves began falling ill. The river, normally alive with commercial traffic, saw boat after boat bypass Natchez entirely. Word had spread that the city was plague-stricken, and no captain wanted to risk crew or cargo by docking there. The physicians worked themselves to exhaustion, moving from house to house, applying their treatments with dedication and increasing desperation. Howell performed bloodletting on 40 patients in a single day, returning home with his coat stained dark. Dr. Fletcher administered mercury treatments until his hands trembled from fatigue. But the death rate didn't slow. If anything, it accelerated. Patients who survived the fever often died from the treatments. From blood loss, from mercury poisoning, from systems too weakened to endure the aggressive interventions. No one questioned the methods. The methods were science. The methods were what every medical school taught, what every textbook confirmed, what centuries of tradition supported. Meanwhile, 10 miles north at the Fairmont plantation, Jonas Ryder watched the fear spread among the enslaved community like ripples in water. News traveled fast through the network of enslaved people who moved between plantations and town, carrying messages, trading information, warning each other of dangers. They heard about the fever in Natchez, about the death toll, about the doctors who couldn't stop it. On June 27th, the fever arrived at Fairmont. A field hand named Samuel collapsed during the afternoon work, fever-stricken and shaking. By evening, 2 more were sick. The overseer, Mr. Talbot, reported it to James Fairmont, who immediately sent for his plantation physician, an elderly doctor named Dr. Graham, who made rounds to several plantations in the area. Dr. Graham arrived the next morning, examined the sick, confirmed yellow fever, and prescribed the standard treatments: bloodletting, purging, isolation. Jonas, helping to carry one of the sick men to the isolation cabin, watched Dr. Graham work. He saw the lancet cut into fevered flesh, watched the blood drain into bowls, saw mercury compounds forced down throats. He said nothing. Speaking out would be suicide. But that night, after Dr. Graham left, Jonas made a decision that would change everything. He went to his cabin and retrieved Margot's leather pouch, hidden beneath the floorboards under his sleeping pallet. Inside were the materials she'd given him: cinchona bark, carefully dried and wrapped; seeds from a plant she'd called strong leaf; dried roots whose purposes he'd memorized. He also carried knowledge, exact preparations, specific temperatures, crucial timing. He had watched 3 people die from yellow fever at Fairmont the previous summer, and he'd watched Dr. Graham apply the same treatments that were now filling Natchez's cemetery. Jonas understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with formal education, that the accepted treatment was killing people faster than the disease. The question was, what was he willing to risk to prove it? Jonas had seen death before, not just death from disease, but death from defiance. When he was 16, another enslaved man at Fairmont, a field hand named Nathan, had dared to speak up during a punishment he believed was unjust. The overseer had been about to whip a young boy for allegedly stealing food, and Nathan, unable to stay silent, had stepped forward and said the boy was innocent, that Nathan had seen someone else take the food. The overseer, enraged at being contradicted by enslaved property, had turned the whip on Nathan instead. But Nathan didn't submit. He grabbed the whip mid-strike, an act so shocking that everything stopped. For exactly 3 seconds, Nathan held the whip, staring at the overseer with something like triumph in his eyes. He was sold within 24 hours, sent to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. Word came back 6 months later that Nathan was dead, worked to death in the cane fields where enslaved people lasted an average of 7 years. The lesson was clear. Any assertion of power, any challenge to authority, any suggestion that an enslaved person might know something a white person didn't, was punishable by torture or death. Yet Jonas also remembered other lessons, passed down through whispered stories in the quarters on long summer nights. Stories of enslaved people who'd saved lives with herbal knowledge, who'd delivered babies when white doctors refused to come, who'd treated infections and fevers and kept children alive through winters that should have killed them. This knowledge existed in the shadows, practiced quietly, never acknowledged by the people who benefited from it. The white doctors might ignore it, might deny its existence, but it was real. Jonas had seen it work. He thought about Margot, about everything she'd survived. The Middle Passage, slavery in Saint-Domingue, the violent revolution that had torn that island apart, the fever outbreaks that killed thousands. She'd survived because she knew things the doctors didn't, and she'd given that knowledge to Jonas knowing he might be the only person who'd use it, who'd remember it, who'd risk everything to prove its value. On the night of June 28th, after Dr. Graham had left and the sick had been isolated in a cabin at the edge of the quarters, Jonas made his move. He prepared the cinchona bark exactly as Margot had taught him, boiled in water at a specific temperature. Not too hot, which would destroy the beneficial properties, not too cool, which wouldn't extract them. He added the root that reduced fever, mixed in a preparation from the strong leaf seeds that helped with the vomiting. He made enough for the 3 sick men in the isolation cabin. He approached the cabin near midnight, when the overseer was drunk and asleep, when the plantation had settled into its uneasy nighttime quiet. The sick men were in bad condition, high fevers, jaundiced skin, the beginning stages of the black vomit that signaled the final phase. Jonas spooned the bitter liquid into their mouths, explaining nothing because there wasn't time, forcing them to swallow despite their weakened state. He stayed with them through the night, monitoring their temperatures, giving additional doses when needed, cleaning them when the vomiting came. By dawn, 2 of the 3 men showed improvement. Their fevers had dropped slightly. The delirium had eased. The 3rd man, who'd been furthest along in the disease progression, died just after sunrise, but Jonas suspected he'd been too far gone by the time treatment started. Still, a 2/3 survival rate was infinitely better than what Dr. Graham's methods had achieved. Over the next 3 days, Jonas quietly treated 12 more cases at Fairmont. He had to be careful, had to move in the shadows, had to make it appear that he was simply helping tend the sick, while Dr. Graham's treatments did the real work. But the results spoke for themselves. Of the 15 people Jonas treated, 11 survived. Of the 8 people who received only Dr. Graham's bloodletting and mercury, 2 survived, and both were young, strong field hands whose bodies could withstand the aggressive interventions. People in the quarters began to notice. They didn't speak openly about it, but Jonas saw it in their eyes, felt it in the way they looked at him when he passed. They knew, and more importantly, they trusted him. On July 3rd, James Fairmont himself commented to his overseer that the fever seemed to be burning itself out at the plantation, that they'd been fortunate to lose only 4 people when neighboring plantations were reporting devastation. The overseer agreed, attributing their good fortune to Dr. Graham's excellent care and perhaps divine intervention. Jonas, standing nearby with a water bucket, said nothing. In Natchez, the situation spiraled into nightmare. By early July, the death toll had passed 150. The city was paralyzed by fear and grief. Families who could afford it fled to relatives in inland areas, abandoning their homes, leaving servants and enslaved people to fend for themselves. Those who remained locked themselves inside, burning sulfur and tar, hanging bags of camphor around their necks, praying for salvation. The streets in Natchez on the hill, usually alive with social calls and commercial activity, were empty except for the death carts that made their grim rounds each morning. Natchez under the hill was worse. The fever tore through the crowded waterfront district like fire through dry grass, killing dock workers, prostitutes, tavern owners, gamblers, boat crews. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside the makeshift hospital set up in a riverside warehouse. The stench of death mixed with the perpetual smell of river mud and human waste. Rats moved freely among the dying, and mosquitoes, though no one yet understood their role, bred in the standing water that collected in every corner. The medical board met daily, increasingly desperate, increasingly at odds with each other over proper treatment protocols. Dr. Howell insisted on aggressive bloodletting. Dr. Fletcher argued for higher doses of calomel. A younger physician, Dr. Martin Chambers, suggested that perhaps the treatments themselves were weakening patients, but he was shouted down by his seniors. The suggestion that educated physicians might be doing harm was absurd, offensive, dangerous to public confidence. On July 8th, something shifted. An enslaved man named Isaiah, who worked for the Pritchard family in Natchez on the Hill, became severely ill with yellow fever. The Pritchards had already lost their teenage son to the fever 3 days prior, and Mrs. Pritchard was beside herself, unable to bear losing anyone else in her household. But Isaiah was valuable property, a skilled carpenter and handyman who'd been with the family for 12 years, and Mr. Pritchard wanted him treated with the same aggressive medical care they'd given their son. Dr. Fletcher was called. He performed bloodletting, administered calomel, prescribed cold baths and isolation. Over the next 24 hours, Isaiah's condition deteriorated rapidly. By July 9th, the black vomit had started, and Dr. Fletcher privately informed Mr. Pritchard that survival was unlikely. That evening, one of the other enslaved people in the Pritchard household, a woman named Ruth, who did laundry and cooking, made a desperate decision. She knew Jonas. They were from the same region in Louisiana originally, had maintained contact through the networks that connected enslaved people across plantations and town. Ruth had heard, through those whispered channels, about what had happened at Fairmont, about Jonas's treatments, about the survival rates that seemed impossible. After dark, Ruth walked the 10 miles from Natchez to the Fairmont plantation. It was dangerous. Enslaved people couldn't travel without passes, and being caught meant punishment. But she'd made the calculation that Isaiah's life was worth the risk. She found Jonas in the quarters and begged him to come back to Natchez, to treat Isaiah before it was too late. Jonas understood immediately what she was asking him to do. Leaving the plantation without permission was illegal. Treating someone without his owner's approval was illegal. Contradicting a white doctor's treatment was potentially fatal. But Ruth was on her knees, tears streaming down her face, and Jonas knew that if he had this knowledge and didn't use it, every death that followed was a weight he'd carry forever. He told Ruth to return to Natchez, to tell Isaiah's family he'd be there the following night. Then Jonas went to his cabin and began preparing the medicines he'd need, crushing bark and roots, mixing preparations, filling small bottles that he could carry hidden in his clothing. He knew there was no going back from this decision. He was crossing a line that would change everything. On the night of July 10th, Jonas left Fairmont and walked through the darkness to Natchez. He moved through the forest, paralleling the main road, avoiding patrols, arriving at the Pritchard house near midnight. Ruth let him in through the back entrance, and he was taken to the small room where Isaiah lay dying. The smell hit him first, the characteristic stench of black vomit, of internal bleeding, of a body destroying itself. Isaiah was barely conscious, his skin the color of old parchment, his eyes sunken and yellowed. Jonas had seen patients this far gone before. Margot had told him the truth. Once the black vomit started, once the disease reached its final stage, even the best treatment only worked perhaps 1 time in 4. But 1 in 4 was better than none. Jonas worked quickly, spooning his preparations into Isaiah's mouth, managing to get him to swallow through sheer persistence. He explained to Ruth exactly how to continue the treatment. The doses, the timing, the importance of keeping Isaiah hydrated without forcing too much liquid at once. He told her what signs to watch for, what would indicate improvement or deterioration. Then, before dawn could catch him in the city, Jonas slipped back into the darkness and walked the 10 miles back to Fairmont, arriving just before the morning work bell rang. For the next 2 days, Jonas went about his regular work, acting as if nothing had happened, while every free moment his mind was in Natchez, wondering if Isaiah would survive, wondering if he'd just wasted medicine on a man too far gone to save, wondering if someone had noticed his absence and a punishment was coming. On the evening of July 12th, Ruth appeared again at Fairmont. Jonas saw her coming up the path to the quarters and felt his stomach drop. Surely she'd only come back if Isaiah had died, if the family was angry, if there was trouble. But when Ruth reached him, she was smiling, crying, holding his hands. Isaiah was alive. Not just alive, but improving. The fever had broken. The black vomit had stopped. He was weak, but he was conscious, aware, asking for food. Ruth said that Mrs. Pritchard, who'd witnessed the recovery, had asked where the medicine came from, who had treated him. Ruth had lied, said Isaiah must have had a stronger constitution than the doctors thought, that God had intervened, but Mrs. Pritchard wasn't stupid. She knew something had changed, some treatment had been applied that wasn't what Dr. Fletcher ordered. "She wants to see you," Ruth said. "Mrs. Pritchard. She says if you can save Isaiah, maybe you can save others." Jonas felt something cold settle in his chest. This was the moment where everything became public, where he stepped out of the shadows and into a light that could burn him alive. But Ruth was right. If he could save Isaiah, he could save others. Hundreds of others, given what was happening in Natchez. "Tell Mrs. Pritchard," Jonas said slowly, "that I'll come. But she needs to understand. If the doctors find out, if they know I'm contradicting their treatments, they'll stop me, they'll arrest me or worse. She has to decide if she's willing to protect me." Ruth nodded and left. 2 days later, she returned with a message. Mrs. Pritchard wanted Jonas to come to Natchez. She would personally guarantee his safety. She wanted him to treat her household, her neighbors, anyone who was sick. She'd seen a miracle, and she wasn't going to let medical pride or racial prejudice prevent more miracles. On July 15th, Jonas Ryder walked into Natchez and began openly treating yellow fever patients with methods no educated doctor in the city accepted as legitimate. He had no idea he was about to save nearly 300 lives, or that doing so would make him powerful enemies among the very men who were supposed to be saving people themselves. Mrs. Pritchard was a woman of considerable social standing. Her husband, Charles Pritchard, owned extensive cotton holdings and served on the city council. And when she threw open her home to an enslaved healer against all social convention, Natchez paid attention. At first it was simple curiosity. Word spread through the networks of servants and enslaved people. Jonas Ryder from the Fairmont plantation was in the city. He was treating fever patients, and people were surviving at rates the white doctors couldn't match. The first few patients Jonas treated beyond Isaiah were household servants in wealthy homes, people whose owners were desperate enough to try anything, whose deaths wouldn't spark outrage, but whose survival might offer hope. Jonas worked methodically, explaining nothing to the white families, but teaching the enslaved caregivers exactly how to prepare and administer the treatments. He knew his best chance of success was to create a network of people who could continue the work, even if he was stopped. A laundress named Dinah learned to prepare the cinchona bark preparation. A coachman named Benjamin learned to identify the right plants for the fever-reducing route. An elderly house servant named Clara learned the timing of doses, the signs that indicated improvement, the ways to keep mosquitoes away from the sick, not because anyone understood why, but because Jonas insisted it mattered. He made them memorize everything, repeat it back to him, practice until they could do it in their sleep. The results were undeniable. Of the first 20 patients Jonas treated directly or through his trained helpers, 16 survived. Compared to the mortality rate under the city doctor's care, which hovered around 70%, Jonas's success rate was miraculous. Families began requesting him specifically, sending servants to find him, offering payment to James Fairmont if he'd allow Jonas to continue working in the city. Fairmont, recognizing a financial opportunity, agreed. For $5 per patient, an enormous sum for the time, Jonas could treat fever victims in Natchez, with the money going directly to Fairmont. It was a devil's bargain that made Jonas profitable property, but it also gave him official permission to move freely in the city, at least within the constrained bounds of treating fever patients. He couldn't legally practice medicine. That remained a crime for an enslaved person. But in the chaos of an epidemic, legal niceties gave way to desperate pragmatism. By late July, Jonas was treating between 10 and 15 new patients per day. He moved through Natchez like a shadow, arriving at houses before dawn, leaving after dark, always accompanied by Ruth or another enslaved person who could verify his presence was authorized. He barely slept, ate only what people pressed into his hands, worked until his body trembled with exhaustion. But the death rate was dropping. Natchez noticed. This is when the medical board noticed too. Dr. Cornelius Howell first heard about Jonas on July 23rd. When he arrived at the Montgomery household to treat Mrs. Montgomery's yellow fever and found an enslaved man already there, administering some kind of herbal preparation. The house servant explained that Jonas Ryder had been treating Mrs. Montgomery for 2 days, that her fever had broken, that the family believed she would survive. Dr. Howell examined Mrs. Montgomery himself, found her conscious and improving, and felt something he hadn't expected. Rage. Not joy at a patient's recovery, not curiosity about what treatment might have worked. Rage that an uneducated slave was being allowed to contradict decades of medical science, that families were turning to folk remedies and superstition instead of trained physicians, that his own authority and expertise were being publicly undermined. Dr. Howell went directly to the medical board and called an emergency meeting. On July the 24th, all 6 board members convened in the city council chambers, and Dr. Howell laid out the situation. An enslaved man with no medical training, no formal education, no legal right to practice medicine was treating yellow fever patients throughout Natchez with unapproved remedies, and families were paying him instead of seeking proper medical care. This is not just illegal, Dr. Howell said, his voice tight with anger. It's dangerous. We have no idea what substances this man is using. He could be poisoning people. The fact that some patients are surviving is likely coincidence. Yellow fever's mortality rate varies naturally. We cannot allow untrained, enslaved individuals to undermine the medical profession and endanger public health. Dr. Fletcher, who'd been one of Isaiah's attending physicians before Jonas's intervention, tried to argue that the results spoke for themselves, that Jonas's patients were surviving at rates far exceeding their own. But he was a young physician, and his voice carried little weight against the senior doctors. Dr. Chambers suggested they at least observe Jonas's methods, perhaps learn what he was doing, assess whether there might be value in his treatments. He was immediately criticized for suggesting that a slave might know something trained doctors didn't, that folk medicine might have anything to offer beyond placebo effects. The board voted 5-1 to petition the city council to ban Jonas Ryder from treating yellow fever patients. They drafted a formal letter citing the danger to public health, the illegality of enslaved people practicing medicine, the necessity of maintaining professional medical standards even during an epidemic. The letter was delivered to the city council on July 25th. Jonas learned about the medical board's petition on July 26th from Mrs. Pritchard, who'd heard through her husband's council connections. She came to the boarding house where Jonas was temporarily staying, a small ramshackle building in Natchez under the hill where enslaved people hired out to work in the city were housed, and found him preparing medicines for the next day's rounds. "They're going to stop you," Mrs. Pritchard said without preamble. "The doctors, they've gone to the council. They're saying you're dangerous, that you're breaking the law, that you need to be arrested and sent back to Fairmont." Jonas looked down at the cinchona bark he was crushing in a mortar, his hands steady despite the fear that climbed his spine. "How long before the council decides?" "They meet day after tomorrow, July 28th. 2 days. In 2 days, the city council would decide whether to shut down the only treatment that was actually saving lives, whether to prioritize medical authority over hundreds of fever victims who still needed help. Jonas knew that the city's death toll had dropped dramatically since he'd started treating patients, from 20 or 30 deaths per day in mid-July to fewer than 10 in recent days. He also knew that wouldn't matter to doctors whose pride was wounded, whose professional status was threatened by an enslaved man's success. "What if I keep working?" Jonas asked. "What if I ignore the council's decision?" Mrs. Pritchard's expression was grim. "Then they'll arrest you. Probably worse. Charles says Dr. Howell is furious, that he's talking about making an example of you, about the dangers of letting slaves think they can practice professions reserved for white men. Jonas, they'll kill you if you defy them openly." But Jonas was thinking about the numbers. 10 patients today, 12 yesterday. If he could treat 15 patients per day for the next month, and if his survival rate held at 75%, that was over 300 lives saved. 300 people who would die if the doctors went back to bloodletting and mercury. If the council banned his treatments, if fear and pride won over evidence and results. 300 lives versus his own. The math wasn't complicated. "I need to speak to the council," Jonas said. "Before they decide. I need to explain what I'm doing, show them the results, make them understand that people are dying from the treatments, not just from the fever." Mrs. Pritchard stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Jonas, you're an enslaved man. The council won't even let you in the room. You have no legal standing, no right to address them, no—" "Then you do it," Jonas interrupted. "You and any other families whose loved ones I've saved, tell them the truth. Show them the survival rates. Make them see that this isn't about medical pride or racial status. It's about keeping people alive." Mrs. Pritchard was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "I'll try. Charles has influence. If I can get other families to support this, families with social standing—" She paused, then looked directly at Jonas. "But you understand what you're risking. Even if the council allows you to continue, the doctors will never forgive this. You'll have powerful enemies for the rest of your life." Jonas thought about Margot, about her final words. Sovio, save them. He thought about Nathan, grabbing the whip, those 3 seconds of defiant triumph before being crushed. He thought about the fever patients he'd seen this morning, their yellow eyes and trembling hands, their desperate hope that someone could save them. "I already have powerful enemies," Jonas said quietly. "I'm enslaved. The whole system is my enemy. But right now, I have knowledge that can save lives, and I'm going to use it for as long as they let me." Mrs. Pritchard left to begin rallying support among the families Jonas had helped. Jonas returned to preparing his medicines, knowing that in 2 days everything would be decided, and that regardless of what the council chose, he'd already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The City Council meeting on July 28, 1822, began at 10 a.m. in the council chambers, an elegant room in the building that served as Natchez' administrative center. The agenda included several routine items, tax assessments, street repairs, licensing disputes, but everyone present knew the real business was the yellow fever controversy, the question of Jonas Ryder, the conflict between medical authority and desperate pragmatism. The medical board's petition was presented first. Dr. Howell spoke for 20 minutes, laying out the case against allowing Jonas to continue, the illegality of enslaved people practicing medicine, the danger of unapproved treatments, the necessity of maintaining professional standards, the risk that Jonas's success was temporary, and patients would suffer long-term damage from whatever folk remedies he was using. Gentlemen, Dr. Howell concluded, this is not about whether some patients have survived. It's about whether we, as a civilized society, will allow untrained slaves to undermine the medical profession and endanger public health based on superstitions and plant mixtures with no scientific foundation. I urge you to ban this practice immediately and insist that all yellow fever patients receive proper medical care from licensed physicians. Then Mrs. Pritchard stood up. The room went silent. Women didn't typically address the city council, and certainly not to contradict the medical board. But Mrs. Pritchard had spent the past 2 days organizing, and she wasn't alone. Standing with her were 8 other families: the Montgomerys, the Harrisons, the Caldwell family, Judge Fairfax, whose daughter had died despite the doctor's best efforts, and 4 other households that had lost people to yellow fever under traditional treatments, but had seen survivors when Jonas intervened. Council members, Mrs. Pritchard began, her voice steady. We are here today not to challenge medical science, but to present facts that may have escaped the board's attention. My household servant, Isaiah, was diagnosed with yellow fever on July 8th. Dr. Fletcher treated him with bloodletting and mercury, the accepted protocols. By July 9th, Isaiah was actively dying. Dr. Fletcher himself said survival was impossible. On July 10th, someone gave Isaiah a different treatment. By July 12th, his fever had broken and he was recovering. Isaiah is alive today because of that treatment. She paused, letting that sink in. Mrs. Montgomery was treated by Dr. Howell for 4 days. Her condition deteriorated steadily. Jonas Ryder was allowed to treat her on July 22nd. Within 2 days, her fever broke. She survives today. The Harrison family lost their son under medical board treatment. Their daughter survived after Jonas treated her. Judge Fairfax lost his daughter Eleanor despite Dr. Fletcher's finest efforts. His neighbor's daughter, treated by Jonas, survived. Mrs. Pritchard looked directly at Dr. Howell. The doctors say Jonas's success is coincidence, that yellow fever mortality varies. But the pattern is clear. Under the medical board's treatments, approximately 70% of patients die. Under Jonas's treatments, approximately 75% survive. Those are not coincidental numbers, gentlemen. Those are results. Charles Pritchard, her husband and a council member, spoke next. The council is being asked to choose between medical authority and documented outcomes. I understand the sensitivity of allowing an enslaved person to practice medicine. It violates numerous laws and social conventions. But we're facing an epidemic that has killed over 200 people in 6 weeks. If we ban the one treatment that's actually saving lives because it offends our sense of propriety or professional hierarchy, how many additional deaths will we be responsible for? The debate that followed was heated. Some council members argued passionately that law and social order had to be maintained regardless of circumstances, that allowing exceptions for enslaved people in one area would lead to chaos in others. Others argued just as passionately that the evidence was overwhelming, that Jonas's treatments worked, that banning him would be tantamount to murder. Dr. Howell pushed back hard. He suggested that Jonas was using dangerous substances, possibly addictive drugs, that made patients feel temporarily better while causing long-term harm. He argued that the medical board had centuries of accumulated knowledge behind their methods, that questioning bloodletting and mercury treatment was questioning the entire foundation of medicine. He implied, without stating directly, that allowing Jonas to continue would undermine white authority in ways that extended far beyond medical treatment. Finally, the council called for a vote on the medical board's petition. The room held its breath. The vote was 5 in favor of allowing Jonas to continue, 4 against. It was close, far closer than anyone comfortable with Jonas's work would have liked. But it was enough. The medical board's petition was denied. Jonas would be permitted to continue treating yellow fever patients, with the understanding that he was working under the supervision of property owner James Fairmont, and that the arrangement was temporary, lasting only for the duration of the epidemic. Dr. Howell stood up, his face dark with fury. "You will regret this decision," he said coldly to the council. "When patients begin dying from whatever uncontrolled substances this slave is administering, when the long-term effects of his treatments manifest, when the rule of law collapses because we've decided that slaves can practice professions reserved for educated white men, you will remember this day." He walked out of the council chambers, followed by 3 of the other medical board members. Only Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Chambers remained, and Fletcher approached the Pritchard family afterward with a quiet request. "Could Jonas teach me what he's doing? I'd like to understand his methods." The yellow fever epidemic in Natchez continued through August, but the character of it changed fundamentally. Jonas, now working openly with the council's permission, trained 24 enslaved caregivers in his treatment methods. He also, to his surprise, found himself teaching several white physicians, including Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Chambers, who were willing to set aside pride in favor of results. Dr. Fletcher proved to be an eager student. He observed Jonas preparing cinchona bark, noted the exact temperatures and timing, asked careful questions about dosing. He began applying the methods himself, and his patient survival rate immediately improved. Dr. Chambers focused on the preventive measures, the mosquito control techniques that Jonas insisted on, though neither man fully understood why keeping mosquitoes away from patients seemed to help. They just knew it did. Dr. Howell and the other senior physicians refused to change their methods. They continued bloodletting and mercury treatments, continued to see their patients die at appalling rates, and continued to blame the deaths on the severity of the fever rather than the treatments themselves. But as word spread about Jonas's success, fewer patients sought out the traditional doctors. Families specifically requested Dr. Fletcher or Dr. Chambers, knowing they'd use Jonas's protocols. The old guard found themselves increasingly isolated, treating only the most conservative families who preferred tradition over results. By the end of August, the fever outbreak was waning. The cooler temperatures of early autumn slowed the mosquito breeding cycle, and the combination of Jonas's treatments and basic preventive measures had broken the epidemic's back. The final death toll in Natchez was 287 people, a horrifying number but far less than it would have been. Dr. Fletcher calculated that based on the mortality rates before and after Jonas began treating patients at scale, Jonas's interventions had prevented between 250 and 300 deaths. On September 4th, when the last active fever case was declared recovered, the City Council held a special session to officially end the epidemic emergency protocols. Charles Pritchard used the occasion to publicly acknowledge Jonas's role, to recognize that an enslaved man with no formal education had saved more lives than all of Natchez's trained physicians combined. The recognition was complex, uncomfortable, hedged with qualifications and explanations that preserved social hierarchies while acknowledging undeniable facts. Jonas was thanked but not freed. James Fairmont retained full ownership. Jonas's knowledge was acknowledged but not legitimized. He was never permitted to practice medicine outside the specific context of the epidemic. The treatment methods were documented and incorporated into some physicians' practices, but Jonas himself was credited only informally, in private conversations, in the memories of families he'd saved. Dr. Howell never spoke Jonas's name again, He practiced for another 8 years, dying in 1830, and his obituary praised him as a pillar of Natchez' medical community. It made no mention of the yellow fever epidemic, of the hundreds who died under his care, of the enslaved man whose treatments he'd tried to ban. Jonas returned to the Fairmont plantation in September 1822 and resumed his life as a field hand. He was not freed, not compensated beyond the money that had gone to his owner, not given any special status. But within the enslaved community across Mississippi and beyond, Jonas became something else. A legend, a symbol, proof that knowledge mattered more than freedom, that truth could overcome prejudice if the evidence was overwhelming enough. He trained others when he could, always quietly, always in the shadows. The network of healers he'd created during the epidemic continued their work, treating illness and injury with methods that combined African traditional knowledge, Caribbean plant medicine, and careful observation. They saved lives the white doctors couldn't save, and they did it without recognition, without permission, without official acknowledgement that they possessed any knowledge worth respecting. Jonas lived until 1851, dying at age 63, remarkably old for someone who'd spent his entire life enslaved. He saw Mississippi's cotton economy expand, saw the institution of slavery grow more entrenched, saw the tensions that would eventually lead to civil war begin to form. He never saw freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation came 12 years after his death, but in the quarters at Fairmont, and in enslaved communities throughout the region, they told stories about Jonas for generations. About the summer when death walked through Natchez, when the educated doctors couldn't stop it, when a slave with bitter bark and determination saved 300 lives. They told the stories to remember that knowledge mattered, that wisdom didn't require permission, that sometimes the most powerless person in the room was the only one who knew the truth. Did it really happen? The historical record is, as always with enslaved people's stories, incomplete. Yellow fever outbreaks in Natchez are well documented, particularly the severe epidemic of 1822. The medical treatments of the era, bloodletting, mercury purging, are confirmed in countless medical journals and letters. Cinchona bark, the source of quinine, was known to be effective against fevers and was used in Caribbean communities long before Western medicine officially accepted it. But Jonas Ryder himself? His name doesn't appear in Natchez's official records, in medical board minutes, in city council documents from 1822. Of course it doesn't. Enslaved people were property, not persons, and their contributions were rarely documented. The absence of proof isn't proof of absence, especially when the story was never supposed to be recorded in the first place. What we know for certain is this: countless enslaved people possessed medical knowledge that white doctors ignored or actively suppressed, knowledge that saved lives, knowledge that was practiced in the shadows because acknowledging it would threaten the fundamental lie that supported slavery. The lie that black people were intellectually inferior, incapable of complex thought or valuable contribution. The erasure was the point. The silence was deliberate. Jonas Ryder might be a name lost to history, or he might be a symbol representing dozens of enslaved healers whose real names we'll never know. Either way, the story is true in the ways that matter most. 300 people lived because someone refused to let ignorance masquerading as education determine who deserved to be saved. The fever passed. The doctors moved on. And in the quarters, they remembered. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by these dark chapters of American history, the stories they tried to erase, the people they wanted forgotten, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we bring you the real stories, the uncomfortable truths, the mysteries that make you question everything you thought you knew. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now. This story raises a question that still haunts us today. How many times has authority silenced truth because accepting the truth meant admitting they were wrong? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, leave a comment. Tell us about a time you saw knowledge dismissed because of who possessed it. Let's start a conversation. And if you haven't already, like this video. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. We're halfway through, and the story only gets darker. But first, have you checked out our playlist of forgotten American stories? Hours of content about the people history tried to erase, the events they covered up, the truths they buried. Click the link in the description and fall down the rabbit hole. You won't regret it. If this story affected you, if it made you see American history differently, if you believe these stories need to be told, share this video. Send it to someone who thinks they know everything about the past. Post it. Spread it. These stories survive only if we refuse to let them be forgotten. And if you want to support this channel and help us keep digging up the truth, check out the membership options in the description. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering.